My god, I really wish I liked Hailey's on It. I know that plenty of people enjoy this show, and I can see the appeal, but it just did not do it for me. When I first heard about Hailey's on It, I thought that it had a lot of promise. A lighthearted cartoon about this awkward teenage girl terrified of taking risks, being told by this future scientist lady, who's totally not related to her in any way, that the fate of the world supposedly depends on her getting out of her comfort zone and completing this list she made of everything she wanted to accomplish but was too afraid to try. That there's a really fun, creative premise for a show. So I watched the first 6 half-hour episodes that dropped on Disney Plus, and it didn't do a whole lot for me. I mean, the episodes were perfectly okay, but despite a solid premise, a pair of likable leads, and bits of charm here and there, Hailey's on It by and large felt disappointingly unremarkable. Now originally, I was going to drop the show then and there, but when I decided to do my top 20 cartoons of 2023 video, I thought that it would be unfair to discuss this show that most people seem to enjoy based on only the first handful of episodes. After all, it was possible that it improved over time, so I caught up with all of the episodes released up until December, and I left with a worse opinion on Hailey's on It than I did before. While it was still just okay, I gradually began noticing an issue that was becoming more and more distracting. That issue being the overarching narrative. For reasons I'll get into in a bit, I was just not vibing with how this show was handling its ongoing story. That being said, there was still a handful of episodes I still hadn't seen, and for whatever reason, the possibility that Hailey's on It could still turn things around with its story was still at the back of my head. Then I heard about what went down in the season finale, and it revealed something that changed my perception of Hailey's on It for the worse. And after watching it myself, I can now say with complete confidence that Hailey's on It has quite easily the worst implementation of an overarching narrative that I've ever seen in a kid's cartoon. Now to all the Hailey's on It stands watching, just put your torches and pitchforks down for a second and let me explain. This isn't me saying that it's the worst kids cartoon with an ongoing narrative. I think we all know what show holds that title. But rather, Hailey's on It is the first kids cartoon I've seen that I think is made actively worse because it has a serious overarching story. The story itself isn't even particularly awful. It just doesn't feel like it belongs in this show. Look, don't get me wrong. I love cartoons that some might call story-driven, which isn't an accurate descriptor for cartoons with serialized narratives, so I'm not using that term here. But the tone and writing style of Hailey's on It simply doesn't lend itself well to a semi-serious story where the future is on the line. Hailey's on It is a lighthearted, fairly grounded, mostly episodic animated sitcom. The very notion of the world being at stake here feels at odds with this show's entire vibe. But wait, I hear you ask, how can that be when it's a show about time travel? Well, that's the thing, hypothetical questioner. It kind of isn't. The really weird thing about Hailey's on It is that despite the sci-fi driven premise, the show barely does anything with its sci-fi elements. Beta, Hailey's robot helper from the future, doesn't have much of a presence in the show, and rarely does anything noteworthy in any given episode. Meanwhile, the Chaos Bots, the show's antagonists, are used very sporadically, barely feel like a threat, and have a similarly lackluster presence in the series. There are entire episodes where Beta, the Chaos Bots, and time travel are all but absent, and the show doesn't feel any different without them. The only sci-fi element that feels remotely necessary here is the future scientist lady, given that she's the one who kicks off the plot to begin with. With that being said, if she were removed from the show, along with the rest of the fantastical elements and the saving the world stuff, and this was simply a show about an anxious girl who decided one day to finish this massive list of things that she always wanted to do just because, what would really change? Because as is, Hailey's on It feels like a grounded slice of life show that just has a serialized story about time travel arbitrarily slapped onto it for some reason. This high stakes time travel plot adds nothing to this show. It feels like this weird elephant in the room that the show only acknowledges every now and then. It almost comes across like the time travel plot was some sort of weird executive mandate, and the crew is actively trying to distance the show from the sci-fi premise as much as feasibly possible. I am almost certain that this wasn't the case, but that would explain so much. Compare this to The Ghost and Molly McGee, another lighthearted slice-of-life Disney Channel cartoon with fantastical elements. Scratch and the Ghost World aren't something tacked onto the show that can easily be ignored half the time. The supernatural is integral to The Ghost and Molly McGee's premise. Most of the stories that show tells are in some way tied to Molly's best friend being a ghost who can cast curses. Meanwhile, time travel and the other science fiction elements of Hailey's On It feel completely superfluous to the majority of the show's episodes. The second season of The Ghost and Molly McGee also has an overarching narrative, but unlike Disney Channel shows that get quote-unquote serious, like Amphibia and The Owl House, the stakes aren't super high to the point where it becomes at odds with a lighthearted tone. Something that I unfortunately can't say about Hailey's On It. And it's not even like you can't have a lighthearted, non-serious story where the world's in danger. Just look at Wander Over Yonder, whose second season is all about stopping Lord Dominator from destroying the entire galaxy. The fact that it's still silly despite the high stakes works here because Wander isn't a grounded slice-of-life sitcom. It's a show about this goofy little alien traveling the galaxy who always inadvertently stops the plots of a wannabe galactic conqueror who wants to kill him. Saving the world feels in line with the tone and setting of Wander Over Yonder, and while Dominator is far more competent and treated more seriously than Lord Hater, she's still every bit as goofy as the rest of the characters and doesn't feel out of place in a silly show like this, nor does her inclusion try to force Wander Over Yonder to be something it clearly isn't. The Ghost and Molly McGee and Wander Over Yonder are both lighthearted shows with a queer sense of identity, shows whose overarching plots complement their setting and tone rather than clash with it, which again, I can't say about Hailey's On It. Now I know what you're probably thinking, what does all of this have to do with this season 1 finale? What could have happened there that further exasperated my issues with there being a serious ongoing plot in Hailey's On It? Well, you see, up until that point, I genuinely thought that the world being in danger was just a complete lie made up by the future lady. Now, if you saw my top 20 cartoons of 2023 video, which odds are you probably didn't, my god, the algorithm fucked me on that one. You'll remember how I explained that many people like myself theorized that the future scientist lady was actually a future Hailey, with this whole saving the world thing being nothing more than a ruse to push her younger self to achieve all the things she regretted not doing. In that video, I was super confident that this was going to be the big twist of Hailey's On It, to the point where I was complaining about how obvious the show made it that this was the direction it was heading. I mean, it just made sense, with how clearly they telegraphed the future lady's connection to Hailey and how the Chaos Bots are basically non-entities who don't feel threatening in the slightest. It stood to reason that they weren't actually a threat to the future and were merely obstacles created by the future lady to give Hailey that extra push she needed. My surefire belief that this was the endgame of Hailey's On It and that it would all come together once the series started to show its full hand was the only thing that kept me from 100% dismissing its ongoing plot as poorly conceived and out of place. Granted, I would have much rather there not be a serialized plot about time travel in this otherwise grounded slice-of-life animated sitcom, but a twist like this would have at least made those elements more palatable. As it turns out though, I was completely wrong. While the future lady being connected to Hailey is still on the table, the season finale all but confirmed that the future lady didn't create the Chaos Bots, with it giving the very strong implication that they were actually made by AC, this kid no one cares about who has a one-sided rivalry with Hailey, meaning that the silly slice-of-life sitcom about time travel, where the time travel plot is mostly an afterthought, actually had serious stakes to it this entire time. This show was never setting up anything clever or subversive, and now that I know this, I just kind of don't have a reason to care anymore. I mean, what's left for me to look forward to in this unfocused, out-of-place time travel story that I don't care about? Seeing if Hailey will finally kiss Scott next season? Because that whole plotline hasn't long overstayed its welcome.
Well, don't just stand there. Kiss her!
As frustrating as this is, though, I realize that I do kind of have myself to blame here. The show told me point blank that the world depended on Hailey finishing her list, and I chose not to believe them because I didn't think that it made sense for the tone and style Hailey's On It was going for. The show told me that the Chaos Bots were the villains, and I chose not to believe them because they were so non-threatening and had so little presence that I thought the show was hinting at them not truly being villains. I wanted so badly for Hailey's on It to win me over that it didn't occur to me that the plot was just as straightforward as it presented itself, that there really is this save the world narrative that completely clashes with the vibe of the show, that the Chaos Bots, these really lame, underwhelming villains, are meant to be genuine threats, that I just can't get behind the general conceit of this show. This is so genuinely baffling to me. I can't think of a single time where a cartoon's high-stakes ongoing narrative felt so out of place that I straight up wouldn't allow myself to believe that this is what they were actually doing. I literally stood there, waiting for the show to say psych, only to set myself up for a complete disappointment. I just don't understand this show. Why put an ongoing sci-fi plot where the world is in danger in a show like Hailey's on It, only for most of the episodes to ignore the sci-fi and serialized elements in favor of being a grounded sitcom entirely disconnected from the conflict? No, I've said this before, but it bears repeating. Hailey's on It is straight up not a show that lends itself well to a high-stakes story. The tone is too grounded, the fantastical elements are too downplayed, and the episodes are too mundane for it to be about saving the world in any capacity. That is, unless they decide to follow the trend of cartoons getting quote-unquote serious in their second season, like with Amphibia and the Owl House, which, contrary to some fans' opinions, I think would be a massive mistake. Amphibia and the Owl House could get away with adopting a more serious tone with higher stakes, following their lighter, more episodic first seasons, because they spent those seasons planting the seeds of a much bigger conflict, making the transition into a darker narrative feel like a natural progression. Plus, they're fantasy shows where the characters are already fighting all sorts of monsters and their lives are regularly put in danger. The idea of Anna or Luz having to eventually fight a big bad villain for the fate of the world doesn't feel like that much of a stretch. With how grounded and sitcom-y season 1 of Hailey's on It is, even with the world at stake, it doesn't feel like it could really transition into a more serious narrative without running into the same problem that Star vs. the Force of Evil did, where it eventually became an entirely different show and abandoned most of what got people into it in the first place. And even then, despite all of the identity and total issues it would develop, there was at least a precedent for Star vs. adopting a more serious, more heavily serialized tone. The show was hinting at a grander story and setting up future plot threads in its largely wacky episodic first season. Also, Star being a magical princess from another dimension fighting the forces of evil wasn't something the show forgot about half the time in favor of being a typical animated sitcom. Hailey's on It just does not know what it wants to be. It's this lighthearted, silly, grounded, mostly episodic slice of life show that also has this weird, high-stakes serialized time travel plot it doesn't seem to want to acknowledge that much. Maybe I could have forgiven how weird and intrusive this time travel narrative was if I found anything about the story itself to be interesting, but it just does nothing for me. I guess Future Lady is kind of cool, but beyond that, Beta, the Chaos Bots, and just everything else related to time travel in this show is unremarkable at best and honestly kind of lame at worst. It's frustrating because, again, I don't think Hailey's on It is bad at all. Buried within this bizarre, tensionless, uninteresting, out-of-place ongoing narrative about time travel is a decently charming, occasionally pretty funny slice of life show with a handful of really likable characters. I really do think that if this were a simple slice of life cartoon without any time travel or pretense of saving the world, I would have found this show to be so much more engaging. Maybe not to the same extent as something like Big City Greens or even Kif. I do have some other gripes with this show. Again, not a fan of the romance, but it'd probably be a solid 7 out of 10. In fact, I'm willing to bet that most fans of the show would have an even better time with Hailey's on It without the overarching sci-fi narrative, given how almost all of the clips I see uploaded online are just funny bits with either Hailey or Scott that don't involve the time travel elements in the slightest. Plus, I think that the very real possibility that Hailey's on It will end up being a one-season wonder would probably hurt less if it didn't have an ongoing story that would be left hanging. The moral of the story here is that giving a kid's cartoon a serialized narrative doesn't always make it better. Hailey's on It could have been a really fun, charming show, which it can be at times, but it's held back by this really lame, out-of-place fantastical narrative where the world needs to be saved. This show really did have potential, but as it stands, I consider Hailey's on It to be a letdown, and a prime example of how not to do a quote-unquote story-driven cartoon.
He said it! He said it!
So what were your thoughts on Hailey's on it? Do you think it handles its ongoing narrative well? Did you also think that they were setting up this whole saving the world thing to be completely bogus? Or am I just dumb? Feel free to discuss in the comments below if you like. Maybe even consider subscribing if you want to hear more of me rambling on about cartoons. Now with all of that said, even though it ended up not being for me, I really do hope that Hailey's on it gets a second season and is ultimately able to tell its full story. It's what both the show's staff and its fanbase deserve. I mean, it's not like its second season could go down the path of Star Versus, where the show's slowly overtaken by an obnoxious, angsty, dragged out, will they or won't they love story. Oh. Right. Please, dear God, don't let Hailey commit genocide on the future.